Hello, SPED 431. It is week 4. Here is your PowerPoint along with lecture notes for chapters 4 and 5, week 4. So first thing, make sure that you complete your lesson 3 or your week 3 rather, check for understanding on your own when you are not in class tonight. Make sure that you get logged on to the Moodle classroom site and complete your week 3 check for understanding quiz. It will be open from 6:30 to 11:59 p.m. And then it will close after that, so make sure that you get that completed on your own. Lesson outcomes for tonight and for the purpose of this PowerPoint. We will be identifying components and the use of anecdotal reports, identifying the 5 observational recording systems and when to use each system, demonstrating the use of several recording systems, demonstrate how to transfer data to a graph, and complete the data portion of the functional behavior assessment or analysis. Week 4 discussion, we will do this in class, so you can actually just skip over this slide. Chapter 4 has to do with collecting data and its procedures for collecting data. So just to start out with kind of the rationale behind data collection, observation and data collection make it possible to determine the effectiveness of an intervention. So as we begin to identify kids for special education services, as we begin to develop plans, as we begin to maybe put some small group intervention in place for academics, we have to do that data collection piece to make sure that what we're doing is working. So data collection allows teachers to make instructional decisions and are the basis for our instructional decisions as we move through our teaching. And it also helps teachers to communicate the intent to change a behavior, for example, on a behavior plan. Behavioral evaluations are an important component of this. They have 2 requirements. One, they must have detailed observation of the current functioning or the baseline, which we'll learn about a little bit later. So we have to be able to identify that baseline and where the student was functioning at prior to any intervention we've put in place. Second, they must have ongoing monitoring and teaching of learning, of teaching and learning rather. So we have to provide progress monitoring to show their progress along the way, and we have to be able to show and prove what skills we are teaching them, what alternative behaviors we're putting in place for them rather than the behaviors of concern, how we're reinforcing that. All of those pieces of behavior we need to be able to show and monitor. When we get to the behavior intervention plan in the second part of the semester, we will focus more on this piece of it. So there are 5 different observational data systems that we can choose from. So we're going to go through those now. You'll notice that most of these slides are starred, so be sure that you are somewhat familiar with each one for next week's check for understanding. So the first one here is frequency. Frequency is just the number of times a behavior occurs. Now our book does a really nice job of giving us some examples here, and we're going to use the same 2 students to talk about their behavior in different measurements. So if frequency is just the number of times a behavior occurs, it's just a count, so just a frequency count. For example, Brett got out of his seat 6 times in 30 minutes. So in a 30-minute period, they tallied 6 times he was out of his seat. Marvin had 8 tantrums on Wednesday. They tallied 8 different times that he had a temper tantrum. Basically, again, all we're doing is counting the number of times a behavior occurs within an observed period. The most common ways to record frequency is just a simple tally count. You can also do that with scatter plotting. We'll go over this in class tonight, and we'll actually practice doing some of this with a scatter plot. The next one is rate. Rate of behavior is the frequency expressed in a ratio with time. You are probably most familiar with this when we talk about reading fluency, when we're talking about the rate of words per minute, or in writing, like a correct writing sequence, if you're familiar with that type of data collection, when we talk about how many correct word sequences written in an interval in a 3-minute time period. So rate of behavior, again, is just frequency expressed in a ratio with time. So here, same two students. Brett got out of his seat 0.2 times per minute, and Marvin had 1.3 tantrums per hour in a 6-hour school day. So it's just taking that frequency and dividing it by the time period, by the rate. It's most commonly used to compare behavior occurrences among varying observation periods. So let's say that you're observing over the day and you're observing for a 30-minute time period, the first block that you observe the student, and then you're observing for an hour, and then the third spot is 45 minutes. When you don't have consistent intervals, then we can take that data and we can divide it by the time ratio and be able to get a rate out of that. The next one is duration. So duration is just the amount of time a behavior lasts. So Brett was out of his seat for a total of 14 minutes, or Marvin's tantrum lasted for 65 minutes. We see that this is more important when we're looking at the length of time lost from instruction. So when I go in and I consult with a teacher about a student who's showing some challenging behaviors, and they would bring up whatever type of behavior and saying we're losing out on so much instruction time. Typically what we would kind of look at as a baseline first would be how much instruction time are they actually losing out on? What is the duration of the behavior that's really causing the hang up? It can also help us see the severity or the intensity of behavior. So if we look back to Brett, he got out of his seat 6 times in 30 minutes. Okay, maybe out of his seat was a quick, 2 seconds, stand up, move around his chair, get back in his seat, versus if we say Brett was out of his seat for a total of 14 minutes. 14 minutes is a lot of lost instruction time. So it does help us see the severity or intensity of a behavior. The next one is latency. I can honestly say that I don't use this one a ton. Tend to use this in my experience more with kind of my kiddos who have executive functioning or adaptive behavior goals. But what latency does, it records the length of time between instructions to perform a behavior and the occurrence of the behavior. So the examples, after I told Brett to sit in his chair, it took him 50 seconds to sit down. It took 20 minutes for Marvin to become quiet after I put him in a timeout. So we're focusing on how long it takes the student to start something, not how long it takes them to do it. Those are two different measurements. So it's just the time between a given direction and when they start engaging in that behavior. And then the last ones I've actually combined here. They're just ones that we don't use a ton, but good to know in the event that you have a student with a behavior that you're not really sure how to record. So topography is just the shape of the behavior or what the behavior looks like. They did not have an example for Brett, so we're only using Marvin on these. As you can see, his behaviors are a little bit bigger, so easier to record topography or the shape of that behavior. Marvin screams, kicks his heels on the floor, pulls his hair during a tantrum. We use that to describe a behavior's complexity, so how complex the behavior is. Next, we've got force. The force measures intensity. So the example they have here is Marvin screams so loudly that the teacher 3 doors down the hall can hear him. The problem with using force, especially in this example here, it's hard to standardize. Depending on which teacher you have 3 doors down the hall, maybe one teacher can hear it, another teacher can't. It's maybe not the best use of measure in this scenario. And then the last one is locus. It describes where the behavior is occurring. So on this one, they have just identified that when he hits his ears during a tantrum. So just kind of narrowing that focus. I can honestly say that I've never used locus or force. So, but again, you may have a student with just some different challenging behaviors where you may need to use those types of recording systems. Anecdotal reports. So I think one of the things I see most commonly when I go in and I consult with a teacher on behavior is they say, oh, I've got all this data, I've got all this information, I have everything I need. You're going to help me get something done with this kid, right? And I go in and I sit down with them, and what I find is that they've got a notebook full of notes, which is great, but it's not real data. So anecdotal reports are just a written description of nearly everything that occurs during the observation period. Again, teachers are really good about like wanting to paint a picture and write a story and tell everything that happened during the day with the student, but we often forget to put it into measurable terms. So if you were doing an anecdotal report, what that should include, it should include the setting, it should include everything the target student says or does and to whom or what. So the student that you're in there watching should include basically everything they do. Everything that is said or done to the target student. So if a direction is given, if a peer is distracting them, regardless of what it is, anything that happens to the target student needs to be reported. It must contain only facts. So you want to avoid using words like he was given a math problem, he liked doing the work, or he didn't like doing the work. We can't prove that. So only facts. You can say he complied or did not comply because those things we can see. The last one is to make sure to include temporal indications to help measure the duration. So if you, as you're taking anecdotal notes, you'll want to make sure to note time. So you don't have to note what's happening minute by minute, but you'll want to establish some intervals. So, maybe every 5 to 10 minutes, you just write down what time it is as you're taking those notes, just for reference to go back on. So when you're done taking anecdotal notes, and this is, I think, probably the most important part, you want to make sure that you go back with that information that you've taken and you actually put it into a format so that it's usable. So on page 63 of your text, there's actually a really nice example of an anecdotal report and then what they have done to that report to make it more observable. So page 63 at the very top there, that figure 4.1, an excerpt from an anecdotal report. You can kind of read through that there. You can see how they've established some times. They've even put in how long things have taken. So there's some duration notes in there as well. And then down below, the following questions, it's like the third paragraph down. They're talking about the content of the anecdotal report and the following questions that help with analysis. So there's 8 guiding questions there that are really good to kind of help filter out the information of an anecdotal report. And then on the following page, on page 64, they've kind of put that information into a table, which looks more like an ABC chart. And we'll go through that a little more tonight in class. But just be careful with anecdotal reporting. Again, you want to make sure that if you do use it, that you have enough information to be able to arrange it in a way that it's easier to see the process. It does take a lot of time to dig through anecdotal notes. Honestly, as an educator, using an anecdotal note is kind of the first stages of identifying a problem behavior. So it's kind of your first step of data collection before anyone else gets involved. And it's basically kind of your information to take to a care team or a PBIS tier 2 team to say, hey, I'm noticing some struggles with this kiddo. And that's typically when like a PBIS tier 3 team member will get involved And that's usually one of the first things they do is just go in for observation, take some anecdotal notes as part of the behavior interview process, if that's the direction that your school would take. But just be careful not to use anecdotal notes too much. There's a time and a place for them. Permanent product recording. So you can think of this kind of like grading. It's similar to checking a spelling test or a math test after a student has completed it. So you actually use data from a product that is produced to determine if a student exhibited a behavior or skill. I think in areas of behavior, this is more commonly used when we talk about, say, adaptive behavior, maybe students with lower cognitive or more cognitive impairments, shall I say. We don't typically use these a lot for behavior. Behavioral dimensions that permanent product recording can lead to. It is good for showing the number of times a behavior occurs out of given opportunities, so good for rate, good for topography to show the correct way of completing a task, and for visible signs such as holes kicked in a wall. So the topography piece of it, I'll just go back to that. I, just as an example, had a student years ago who was on the autism spectrum, had some issues with initiating work and then also completing work. So we made kind of a task analysis for him, breaking down each task. And then he was able to show and check off that he completed each of the steps. So, and then he turned in his work with the task analysis checklist, and that was kind of our permanent product recording. We could see what steps he did complete independently and which ones he did not. Outside of that, permanent product recording, again, isn't probably one of the most common to use. Then we have observational recording systems. So we will also go through these pretty heavy tonight in classes. Some of you have them in your case studies. So observational recording systems provide samples of behavior as the behavior is occurring. So these are the most commonly used data collection procedures. So we're collecting it as it's happening versus the permanent product, which we collect afterwards. So event recording. Event recording most accurately reflects the number of times a behavior occurs. Tallying helps identify the frequency of behavior. Rate can be determined by comparing the frequency of observed behavior to the periods of time, written either as a decimal or percentage. And the most common method, this is the most common method used when the goal is to increase or decrease the number of time a student engages in undesired behavior. So you can see we can hit frequency here, we can hit rate here, whether it be in percentage or as a decimal in comparison to time. It really is probably the most common recording system for behavior. So part of that are controlled presentations, and that is one way to collect data using observational recording systems. Controlled presentations are when a teacher controls the number of opportunities for behavior to occur. It's most commonly used to find the rate or frequency of a behavior. So some examples here, if we were trying to find the number of times Mel talks out in an hour, or the number of times Charlie hits in a 20-minute recess. There, again, are some great examples of controlled presentation in your book on pages 71 and 72 that you can just look over. So yeah, those are some good examples there of what controlled presentation looks like. Interval recording and time sampling are used to record an approximation of the number of times a behavior occurs. Instead of counting the behavior, the number of intervals the behavior is observed is counted. So a time that we use this often is when the behavior happens several times throughout the day. If you think of, I think the first thing that comes to my mind is a student with some ADHD tendencies that maybe is disruptive out of their seat, just kind of driven by a motor all day long. and has a hard time really sitting and focusing and staying on task. Rather than sit down and tally every single time that kid does something to be off task, which would be a full-time job if we're really talking about a kiddo who shows true ADHD tendencies and again appears to be driven by a motor. This gives us more of an approximation of the number of times that that would happen during the day and how disruptive it is. So you want to use it on behavior that is easy to see and that happens enough that you could observe it basically at any point in time in the day and you could get similar results. So there are two different types. There's interval recording and there's time sampling. Interval recording is probably the most common. Both are similar in that the teacher defines a specific time period for monitoring, divided into equal intervals, and records the number of intervals the behavior is observed during that time. The biggest difference is that interval recording is most commonly divided by seconds, and time sampling is most commonly divided by minutes. So time sampling happens over a longer period of time. Interval recording is usually a shorter snippet of time with some shorter intervals. And again, we're going to practice that tonight. Coded data sheets. Sometimes a behavior is more complex or we're measuring more than one behavior at a time. And so we need to use coded data sheets. A coded data sheet contains a legend or key with codes for observed behavior. You can have a simple legend as where you have kind of the codes and whoever is recording can just write in the code that they see. You can also have a prepared format where you have the codes preloaded into your data recording format, and then you can either like circle or cross off which of those behaviors you observed during that time period. Again, there's some great examples in the book. If you look at figures 413 and 414 on pages 80 and 81, it shows some great examples there of the two different types of coded data sheets. Okay, so this seems like a lot. It seems overwhelming. How can we get it all done? Data collection is, I mean, it's a challenge. It really is. It's hard to fit it into your day with everything else that you have going, but it's necessary. So it's important to determine how much data to collect and how often to collect the data. And those are decisions made by the IEP team when deciding how to monitor the behavior. Typically, and this is just typical, it's not in all cases, but typically the bigger the behavior, the more frequently we monitor that behavior. Again, if you think of, I like to throw out aggression as one of the big behaviors. If a student is aggressive on a regular basis, you don't only want to have data on that on one day, say one day of the week. And only record it every couple weeks because we could be missing a lot of things that are happening. So it doesn't really paint us a true picture. So bigger the behavior, typically, the more frequently we monitor. All adults working with a student whose behavior is to be monitored are responsible for helping collect data. So it's not just the special education teacher. It can be the gen ed teacher. It can be a paraprofessional. Sometimes it's, the person at lunch who's overseeing the lunchroom if their behavior needs to be monitored at lunch. So it really just depends on who the responsible adult is during that period. Reliability is another thing that's really important. Reliability checks should be done from time to time just to make sure that the behavior is being monitored correctly. After time, we get used to observing a certain behavior, and we just want to make sure that it's being done correctly. So every once in a while, what you want to do is what's called an inter-observer reliability check. That's when two people will go in to record the same data in a given observation and compare the data to get a reliability rate. So again, just to make sure that we're getting, that we're really still monitoring the same data, that we're monitoring it the correct way, and that we're reporting the most accurate data that we have. So with reliability and with the inter-observer reliability check, there are some biases just to watch out for. The first one is probably the most common. It's reactivity. So students can and will for sure act different when they know they're being watched. I'm sure you've all been in a classroom before where you're, taking some data or just taking some notes, really doing an observation, and the kids know you're there. Um, they're looking around. It's like when the principal walks in the room, everybody automatically just switches to their best behavior. So there is some of that can affect when you have a second person in there doing a reliability check. The second one is observer drift. So sometimes an observer will kind of create in their mind their own definition of what the behavior looks like, and they can actually end up reoperationalization. I can't even say that word. Reoperationalizing the behavior. So basically, they're coming up with their own definition of what that behavior should look like. Complexity. The more complex the coding system, the more likely it will be that you are off when comparing data with an inner observer. And then the last one is expectancy. So whether we want to acknowledge it or not, it is true that there are preconceived notions about a student that can definitely take effect and damage the results of data. So maybe it's something they've heard from a previous teacher. We've seen those teachers who can kind of nitpick things, so things we have to watch out for as well. Chapter 5, we're going to do more hands-on with Chapter 5 as we look at data and build our graph, but I did want to point out this table, which is Table 5.1 on page 94 of your text. I just thought this table really did a nice job of summarizing the different graphing procedures. So it goes into talking about the different types of recording: permanent product, event, interval recording, time sampling, duration, latency. Talks about how to convert the data. And you can kind of read through that there. I won't read through all of it, plus we're going to talk about it in class. But very, very important to know, and a very good graphic to go back to. Transferring data to a graph. So different ways to do this. Again, it's kind of outlined on that first table. When transferring event data to a graph, event data may be recorded as number of occurrences. It may also be recorded as a percentage. When we're transferring rate data to a graph, the teacher's concerned, we're using this when teachers concerned with both accuracy and speed. Again, we see this a lot when we're talking about reading fluency. Transferring interval and time sampling data to a graph, reported as the number or percent of total observed intervals. Again, we'll practice this tonight in class. How do we transfer duration data to a graph? That is reported as either the time it takes for a student to complete a behavior or how long the behavior occurs. So just depending on what behavior we're looking at there. To transfer latency data to a graph, we report the elapsed time between a direction given to complete a behavior and when the behavior actually begins. Remember, don't confuse it with how long it lasts. It's from the time we give direction to the time the behavior begins. So some additional graphing conventions, just some terminology that you need to know. Notice this is starred. The first term is conditions. So when we talk about conditions, it's phases of an intervention during which different approaches or techniques are used. So we talked about conditions when we talked about behavioral observations. So there are conditions when we talk about progress monitoring as well. Baseline data. Baseline data is the current level of functioning, and it's the observed behavior prior to any type of intervention. So when we go through our data tonight, what you will see is baseline data. What we do in class, we will build off of that as we begin to build interventions and behavior plans. And then the last one is a phase change. Phase changes are extremely important. A phase change documents when the intervention or something in the environment, programming, monitoring, anything changes that may affect that behavior. For example, I just had a phase change on all of my reading goals as we moved up from 4th grade to 5th grade. So there's a phase line change on their graphs that show that there's something different in their programming that may affect their progress. If an intervention is changed, we put in a phase line change to show that something is changed in their programming. Maybe it's the number of minutes that they're attending social skills group. Maybe it's the amount of students they're attending social skills group with. Maybe we're progress monitoring in a little bit different way because the way that we were progress monitoring isn't giving us the data that we need to see. So anytime we make a change to a student's plan, we need to put a phase line change so that we can note whether that change was positive or negative. There are a couple videos here if you need help with creating graphs. We are going to be using line graphs for the purpose of this assignment. So whether you're using Google Sheets or Excel, there are YouTube videos attached here that you can watch for kind of a how-to tutorial if you need additional help. Case study assignment number 2, we will go through together in class, whether you're on Zoom or live in person, and we'll look at our example number 2, our Rachel study together, and look at that data. So your assignments for the week. You have your case study assignment number 2, the highlighted boxes, which are due Friday, September 18th at 11:59 p.m. Please make sure that these are turned in on time. Also, please make sure that you put your last name in the title of the document that you submit, please. I only had a few with last names attached to it, so when I was grading them, it took me a little while longer to separate everyone's out. So please make sure to add your name in the subject. You've also need to read Chapter 7 in full, prepare for Week 5 in-class discussion, which we will do next week. You will have your Week 4 check for understanding next week, and review the requirements for case study assignment number 3, which is the final part of your FBA before we make all the amendments and change and submit them for midterm. If you have questions on your case study assignment number 1 that was turned back to you, I did put notes on all of those as well as attach the rubrics so you can see the grading that I used. You do have the opportunity to make those corrections to earn the additional points that you may have missed out on. If you do that, what I want you to do, just so that I can keep straight what was changed and what was not changed, let's say that you need to make some changes to the first box, your behavior of concern. This week, when you submit your case study assignment number 2, if you would also make your changes and paste them into that first box there, that behavior of concern, if that's the box you need to change, then I will know to go back and read those and see if the corrections have been applied and see if I can give you any additional points. Let me know if you have questions on that. If that doesn't make sense, we'll go over that in class tonight. Again, if you have any questions, concerns, comments, anything for me, just holler. I will see you all in class at some point tonight, and I hope everyone is safe.